Among the transitions from socialist systems to so-called democratic regimes, Nicaragua is one of the most emblematic and stark cases. After 40 years of rule by the Somoza dynasty, Daniel Ortega and the Sandinistas came to power in 1980. But after 10 years of communist reforms and a civil war fueled by the United States, the Sandinistas peacefully handed over power in 1990 to Violeta Chamorro. According to some, a democratic transition had begun that would be an example for the whole world. But the story would be very different because 16 years later, the Sandinistas and the Ortegas would return to power and would hold it for 20 more years and counting. Why was there never a different transition that truly displaced Sandinismo? How did the Ortegas manage their return and hold on to power? Join us to learn about the transition that never happened. This is Reynaldo José Carrillo Vilches. Join me to learn about the story of the transition that never happened. By the late 1970s, the Central American country of Nicaragua was governed by Anastasio Somoza Devalle, the youngest son and heir of Anastasio Somoza Garcia, founder and patriarch of the controversial Somoza Dynasty, a quasi-monarchical family that since 1937 not only held the political power of that country, but also controlled much of its economy through family businesses in strategic sectors such as energy, agriculture, and manufacturing. They were supported by the agricultural sector, economic power groups in the Liberal Party, and the United States. This took place during the Cold War, where the Somoza family presented themselves as staunchly anti-communist. Between the 1950s and 1960s, Nicaragua experienced one of its most prosperous periods, thanks in part to the export of coffee and cotton and its integration with regional financial institutions. Both Anastasio Sr. and his two sons became presidents of the Republic. However, by the late 1970s, the power of this family was already in clear decline. In addition, economic and social problems and growing political conflict led to increasing opposition against Somoza, embodied by the Catholic clergy, especially the Jesuits. The so-called Broad Opposition Front, which brought together politicians, businessmen, and civilians who wanted a democratic transition but were not socialists. And the famous Sandinista National Liberation Front, an armed socialist and communist group that not only longed for the fall of Somoza, but also for the establishment of a regime of this kind. Anti-Somoza sentiment was growing stronger, not only among the lower classes, but also within Nicaragua's upper class, embodied by the famous Group of 12 who ended up delivering the final blow to the last of the Somozas. The Sandinistas carried out political work while also engaging in armed actions, assaults, and increasing attacks. When the Somoza government assassinated journalist Joaquin Chamorro in 1978, the conflict intensified. This marks the beginning of a civil war between the Somoza government and the leftist guerrillas, which would leave tens of thousands dead and continue until the fall of Somoza. The Sandinista fighters were financed and diplomatically supported at the time by countries ranging from Castro's Cuba to Mexico and Venezuela, both under the democratic two-party systems in those countries. At the same time, there was also a shift in the United States regarding its support for the Somoza regime. The U.S. government cut back on arms sales and turned its back on them diplomatically. Along with the pressure from several countries, the growing political and military rise of the Sandinistas, who were not the majority, but were better organized and united as a minority, and the loss of support from the National Guard led Anastasio Somoza Devalle to resign from the presidency on July 17, 1979, ending a dynastic regime of more than 40 years in Nicaragua. After Somoza was overthrown, power was assumed by the so-called National Reconstruction Junta, presided over by the young 34-year-old Sandinista with a long history in the movement, named Daniel Ortega, with the stated aim of stabilizing Nicaragua to pave the way for a democratic transition. This government would quickly gain widespread recognition around the world, including from the United States, which also provided additional aid of $75 million for the new stage that was beginning. The Sandinistas found a country in critical condition, with 50,000 dead from the war with Somoza, massive migration of skilled professionals, a stagnant economy, and an external debt of over $1.6 billion. The first measures taken by this junta were the nationalization of the banks and the expropriation of the vast assets of the Somoza family, agrarian reform, extensive social assistance programs, and the development of socialist-style industrialization plans. However, these measures could not be completed, not only because of Nicaragua's productive and managerial shortcomings at the time, but also because of the events we will narrate next. As time went by, it became evident the junta, rather than seeking democratic openness, intended to consolidate a socialist government in Nicaragua for as long as possible. This reality led to the departure of moderate members from the junta, such as Alfonso Robledo and Violeta Chamorro, widow of Joaquin Chamorro, a journalist who was murdered during the final days of the Somoza regime, and a figure who would become very relevant in the following years. The idea that socialism or even communism was being consolidated in Nicaragua. This idea is reinforced because these groups began drawing closer to the Soviet Union and other communist bloc countries such as Cuba, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, among others. The controversy became even more heated with the arrival of Ronald Reagan at the White House in 1981. Reagan, unlike his predecessor Jimmy Carter, saw the Nicaraguan situation as an issue that required a quick U.S. intervention to secure its geopolitical interest. So starting in 1981, Reagan authorized the CIA to train, promote, and finance the so-called counter-revolutionaries, more popularly known as the Contras, with the aim of overthrowing the Sandinista government to establish a new regime, starting armed confrontations against a government that, according to CIA reports, was growing significantly in military strength. But the Contras were not necessarily a unified armed group, but rather a series of organizations, such as the Nicaraguan Democratic Forces, the Revolutionary Democratic Alliance, and several indigenous militias. At their peak, the Contras had up to 22,000 trained fighters in Nicaragua. With specialized training and funding from the CIA, which during the Reagan era reached about $400 million, among financial contributions that were duly authorized by the U.S. Congress, and covert sums that later came to light, like the famous Iran-Contra case, a case in which the U.S. government secretly sold weapons to Iran, while the United States had Iran under embargo and was supporting Iraq in the war against Iran. To use that money from the arms sale, among other things, to support the Contra groups in Nicaragua and a drug trafficking network in the region, a network that even ended up benefiting the Sandinistas as well. Several of the Contra groups even became key agents for drug trafficking in the region. The same trafficking that helped flood the United States with drugs during the 1980s crack epidemic. Let's go back to the years before what many thought was the beginning of the democratic transition in Nicaragua. The truth is that shortly after Ortega came to power, the actions of the Contras and the sectors of the opposition to the Sandinistas, convinced that the Sandinista movement was going to establish communism in Nicaragua, began launching attacks that turned into a civil war with the Sandinista government. The actions of the Contras and the CIA during the first half of the 1980s included sabotage of key infrastructure, such as fuel depots, bridges, transmission towers and ports, attacks on agricultural cooperatives, disruptions of coffee and cotton harvests, and various forms of media opposition. So Nicaragua is experiencing a critical situation. Statist government policies that seriously hurt the economy, combined with an informal civil war that made it collapse completely. By 1985, the junta organized presidential elections in which Daniel Ortega, leader of the reorganization junta and undisputed leader of the Sandinistas, was elected. However, when Ortega became president, he was overwhelmed, unable to navigate the pressure from the Contras, the Nicaraguan opposition, and the United States. That year, 1985, Ronald Reagan imposed a trade embargo. Inflation was reaching 335%. Daily life was also dominated by endless violence between both sides, between the Contras groups and the Sandinistas, which included attacks on health centers, kidnappings, torture, executions of innocent people, rape of women, expropriations, and burning of innocent people's homes, and many more crimes. Even so, Ortega manages to stay in power for a while longer. By 1988, hyperinflation in Nicaragua had reached 33,000%. State revenues were very low. Violence was rampant throughout the country, poverty was extreme, and the war situation forced Ortega to seek a negotiated solution to the conflict. This solution came with the Sapua agreements. That same year, when the Sandinistas and Contras agreed to a ceasefire, which effectively ended the major clashes and a very painful war for Nicaraguans. The details of that ceasefire were finalized in the Toncontín Protocols in March 1990, marking the definitive end of Nicaragua's civil conflict. As part of the agreements that year, in 1990, Ortega moved up the presidential elections in Nicaragua. In those elections, Ortega ran for the Sandinistas, who believed their victory was certain, and Violeta Chamorro, one of the most well-known anti-Sandinista voices, ran as the candidate for the National Opposition Union, a liberal right-wing party. The result was a surprising victory for Violeta Chamorro with 55%. It was an unprecedented situation for Nicaragua. After 10 years of a military, socialist regime, the Sandinistas, civil war, and severe economic crisis. Ortega, pressured by internal actors and the peace agreements, voluntarily handed over power to his main opponent. For some, a transition to democracy was beginning, which some also foresaw would be a great example for the world of political transitions of this kind, and that it could also mean the final nail in the coffin of socialist Sandinismo in that country. But the story turned out differently. This transition process, with Violeta Chamorro as its public face, aims to carry out a complete reform or redesign of the state. This is a process overseen not only by Chamorro, but also by men like Antonio Lacayo, who kept the Sandinistas under control and the business sector represented by COSEP. The United States also gives support and oversight to this process, and then President George Bush Sr. lifts the economic sanctions against Nicaragua. They also send loans and financial aid to Nicaragua and secure their interests in the country. In turn, the UN and the OAS intervene in this process, especially regarding the disarmament and demobilization of the Contras and the Sandinista groups. As a first step in this process, and in compliance with the peace agreements, Chamorro actively oversees the total disarmament of the Contra groups and the reduction of the Sandinista army, as was indirectly demanded by the United States. In its place, regularization is carried out, and a police force without partisan connotations is established. At the same time, freedom of expression is expanded. Secondly, a set of measures typical of the IMF and World Bank era are implemented to reorganize the economy. A new currency is introduced, strict fiscal discipline enforced, drastic public spending cuts, and privatization of state companies. And a large part of Nicaragua's foreign debt is forgiven and restructured. And although these measures contributed to the country's macroeconomic stabilization, they came with numerous social problems and income gains that took a long time to reach the population. The number of unemployed people increases significantly. Numerous social assistance, educational programs, and food subsidies are suddenly eliminated, and access to basic services that were previously part of public spending becomes difficult for various sectors. In fact, although some considered these measures necessary for the future, in the short and medium term they caused an increase in the cost of living. Poverty increases, and there is a wave of Nicaraguan migration to neighboring countries and the United States. And from this discontent, disadvantaged sectors of the population, labor unions, Daniel Ortega, and the Sandinistas see the opportunity and begin to gather and regain support to once again regain power, this time through the ballot box. After Chamorro's presidential term ended in 1997, Ortega ran for election again, but he was defeated by Arnoldo Alemán from the center-right Constitutionalist Liberal Party. With Arnoldo Alemán, free market economic reforms continued and the free trade agreement with the United States was signed. But a large part of the population still did not clearly see the promised changes, even though the country's GDP was increasing every year. This income was barely reaching the lower strata and even part of the middle strata of society. That, combined with events like the devastation caused by Hurricane Mitch in 1998, the weak state response to the devastation, and the numerous cases of corruption in the upper echelons of the government, they gradually undermined the image of the regime that had been established since 1990 when the Sandinistas handed over power. And although the Sandinistas maintained a leftist discourse very much opposed to the government, they were secretly participating in the same political scene with the ruling party. Well, with Arnoldo Alemán, Daniel Ortega is one of the main figures in the so-called Alemán-Ortega Pact, in which both men, representing the Constitutionalist Party and the Sandinistas, respectively, divide up public offices and establish a strong two-party system that controls all branches of the state. This two-party system remains in place until Enrique Bolaños becomes president for the 2002-2007 term. Bolaños, among other things, actively tries to end the existing status quo in the country by promoting an extensive anti-corruption campaign. This puts the Alemán-Ortega Pact in check and brings high officials from Alemán's government to trial, including Alemán himself. Feeling threatened, Ortega led the Sandinistas, and Alemán led the Constitutionalists from prison between 2004 and 2005. They promoted in the National Assembly, which they controlled, the enactment of a series of reforms that practically rendered the office of the President of the Republic useless, revoking control over public service regulatory bodies and the power to appoint ministers. It was a sort of coup against Bolaños, who effectively ceased to be the president, with the Sandinistas and Constitutionalists in the National Assembly taking over a large part of the executive branch, controlling the budget and enacting laws. Although he remained in office nominally, Bolaños was left politically powerless. In this scenario, they framed an economic situation that, it must be said, improved in many aspects, such as a reduction in poverty and unemployment. A good part of Nicaraguans longed for peace and social stability in the face of what for them was an endless plot of corruption, clientelism, and political opportunism, among other things. And this is where Daniel Ortega, the eternal leader of the Sandinistas, appears, presenting himself as the only one capable of bringing order to Nicaragua. In this way, backed by the entire left, Daniel Ortega will win the elections with 38% of the votes, while the right and center were extremely divided. It seems that the Nicaraguan transition had returned to where it started. Not only were the Sandinistas returning to power, but an Ortega era was also beginning, one that has lasted to this day. Daniel Ortega became president in 2007 with the slogan, "Christianity, Socialism, and Solidarity." In his early years, Ortega allied himself with the other movements of the so-called Latin American socialism of the 21st century. He took particular advantage of his alliance with then Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez. Frias, who, through the Venezuelan oil company Albaniza and Alba, transferred millions of dollars to Nicaraguan coffers, which would be managed by the Ortega system. It is estimated that the money contributed by Chavez to Nicaragua was $4.5 billion, which at one point represented up to 10% of the entire Nicaraguan GDP. In a situation that was not the best economically, these resources received by the Nicaraguan state were key to helping stabilize and sustain the growth of the GDP, which had already been growing at nearly 4% year over year. A situation similar to the case of Cuba and Bolivia, whose economies grew at the expense of Venezuelan oil and income. In 2012, backed by the results of a major program of medical assistance, literacy, sanitation, public works, and more that the Ortega regime had launched in Nicaragua, he thus secured approval for indefinite re-election. It was not in his plans, as in the 1980s, to have to hand over power again. In this way, Ortega manages, with this indefinite re-election, and especially with increasing influence over the control of public state institutions, to get re-elected without major problems for 3 different terms. At the same time, he maintains police and military control over dissent, along with a selective and efficient repression and control of political dissent in the country. How different from that former opposition and civil society that managed to displace Ortega's regime. This second time, the government did not allow it to prosper. At the same time, the current president of Venezuela, Nicolás Maduro, provided financial aid to Nicaragua. Between 2012 and 2017, not only did Nicaragua experience its best economic moment in recent history, but Ortega's regime was also consolidated, with what some have called a silent takeover of all the country's public institutions, which are now under Ortega's control. At the same time, the now normalized practice of persecuting, imprisoning, and exiling opposition forces began. These groups, just like the independent media, have seen their role in Nicaraguan politics drastically reduced. Through the use of the national police and paramilitary groups loyal to Ortega's regime, they have been neutralized. And the definitive turn of Ortega's regime happened in 2017, when, due to the Venezuelan crisis, the aid that Venezuela was giving to Nicaragua abruptly stopped. This resulted in an alarming economic contraction and the decline of social programs that were key to Ortega's political and social support. This led to growing public discontent at the time, which sparked protests like those in April 2018, when the government withdrew its support for the private sector and blamed it, along with the opposition, for the country's problems. When the so-called COVID-19 arrived, even though the economy was already contracted and disapproval rates were high, Ortega had already consolidated control over the institutions. His new political regime had the final say over governance and the leadership of the state. And by taking advantage of the quarantine measures being implemented around the world, Ortega employed a zero-tolerance policy against the opposition, the media, and the Catholic Church. Once the quarantine measures were lifted, the regime chose to intensify the shift of its foreign aid-dependent model away from Venezuela and toward the Eurasian axis, striking major infrastructure and technology deals with Russia, China, and Iran, and experiencing gradual economic growth driven by its controlled mining and agribusiness exports. Although hindered by international sanctions imposed on Ortega's regime, which is now one of the most condemned by the entire international community. Nicaragua's economic model, as Ortega initially attempted, is one of strict state control over resources and a diversification of external trading partners, such as China, Russia, and Iran, to mitigate the impact not only of the country's low productive capacity, but also of the sanctions. The Nicaraguan economy is currently at such low levels of productivity that remittances from families in other countries are the main driver of domestic consumption. As for Ortega, today many accuse him of promoting a regime very similar to that of Anastasio Somoza when it comes to the exercise of power. Especially Anastasio Somoza, the son, in his last days, regarding the fact that Daniel Ortega and his family are the wealthiest and most influential power group in the country, by far, with an alleged fortune estimated at $2.5 billion, and the presence of several family members in key positions within the state. For example, since 2025, Rosario Murillo, Ortega's wife, is the co-president of Nicaragua, making this country the only one currently with this position, and 2 alleged heads of state. And several key positions within the state are held by family members. Several of their children are also involved, such as Laureano Ortega Murillo, who is in charge of international relations, Daniel Edmundo, Juan Carlos, and Maurice Ortega Murillo, who are in charge of the media and the regime's propaganda apparatus, as well as Camilo Ortega Murillo, who leads the Creative Economy Commission to project the image of a functional economy internationally. As things stand today, Daniel Ortega's Nicaragua continues to be governed by this family, which seems to aim to surpass the Somoza family's record for total years in power. There are many reflections and comments that can be made when analyzing this phenomenon of political transition as applied in Nicaragua, as a perfect example of the phenomenon that some call gatopardismo, which in some way suggests that everything must change so that everything stays the same, and that it offers small, temporary, and superficial changes. Meanwhile, the political system remains the same. According to some scholars, this transition was poorly executed, among other things, because it prioritized macroeconomic indicators over social and political demands. In a system marked by corruption, clientelism, and other phenomena that have always existed in that political system, a transition that never happened, which will continue to give people a lot to talk about. Thank you all for watching this video. I'd like to remind you that you really help us by leaving your comments, liking the video, subscribing to the channel, sharing the video with all your friends, and clicking the bell to activate notifications. This was Reynaldo Jose Carrillo Vilches speaking to you. This is La Nueva Enciclopedia. As always, we thank you for all your support, and many blessings to everyone.